Okay, everybody. Hello. Welcome to Woodland Wildlife Wednesdays. I see that it's 12 noon. I appreciate y'all coming and having the flexibility to meet us this week instead of the originally set date. I appreciate that. I'll tell you one of the reasons why I changed the date. I went to wildland firefighting training, so it was great. So I appreciate everybody's flexibility in meeting this week. So I appreciate that. So Woodland Wildlife Wednesdays. Oh, so my slide is deciding to advance. There we go. So today's webinar, bats, bat research, and conservation in Maryland. So we're going to find out about what's happening here in our own state. Next month, it's going to be about at the Emerald Ash Borer and what they're finding out here in Maryland. Diane Leeson, University of Maryland, Environmental Science and Technology. She's going to talk about a great project she's doing well, she's doing some of it in the lower in the shore here. I'm living in Oxford, and she's doing some on the western shore. So her research is very exciting. So that'll be in July. So some housekeeping items. As you may remember, the webinar is being recorded. So we thank you for staying on and letting us record this. It'll be available on our website. There's the link for it. And what will happen is this link will also get emailed to you. So if you want to share it with other people, let them know what you learned today. That's great. I'm your host today. My name is Agnes Kedmanidze. I work for the University of Maryland Extension. I coordinate the Maryland-Delaware Master Logger Program, and I do landowner outreach. So if you have any tree questions, forestry questions, call me. You know, if I don't have the answer, I know a few people that do. So I'd love to talk to you about your woods or the trees that you have, or what you're thinking about your trees and your woods. If you have any questions or comments during the presentation, because how we're going to do it is we're going to have Dan do his presentation, and then at the end we'll have a Q&A session. We'll have a question and answer session at the end. So if you put your questions or comments in the chat box, you can see that bubble there. Excuse me. Then we'll be able to get to your questions. So please put your questions in there. One of the benefits of registering is you're going to get the Branching Out newsletter. It's a great newsletter to keep you up on some events that are happening in Maryland, some tree forest related information. If you want to opt out of that, hey, you can. You can just email Pam there and she'll opt you out of that. But it's a great newsletter. So today's webinar, let's get on with it. Bats, bat research and conservation in Maryland. Bats are a critical component in a healthy forest ecosystem. They also provide significant agricultural pest control and pollination. Their survival is essential to Maryland's forests. So Dan Feller is our speaker today. And he's a Western Regional Ecologist with the Wildlife and Heritage Service, Maryland Department of Natural Resources. He's responsible for the conservation of rare, threatened, and endangered plants, animals, and communities in the Western region of Maryland. Dan's 32-year career has included research, inventory, and monitoring of a wide range of fauna and flora, with a research focus on small mammals and cave groundwater obligate invertebrates. He has a wide variety. Wow, when I read that, I thought of the food chain right there when I read that. So he has an interesting story to tell. I wish we had more time with him. So what we want to find out is, where are you from? We have a poll here. Where are you from? Let's find out. I am from Eastern Maryland. I'm living in Oxford, Maryland right now. Talbot County. What county are you from, Dan? Where are you joining us from today?
I'm in Western Maryland. I'm at the Appalachian Laboratory in Frostburg, Maryland.
Nice. Okay. Wow. So we got a nice variety of people joining us today. Some people outside of Maryland. Hello. Welcome. Welcome. All right, you guys, thanks for letting us know where you're from. Eastern Maryland. Okay. So without further ado, Dan, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and I'll let you take it over.
Okay. Thanks for the great introduction, Agnes. Appreciate it. I'm going to talk today about bats, bat research in Maryland, and conservation of bats in Maryland. So our topics will specifically be what is a bat, some interesting things about bats, what bats are in Maryland, what dangers do are bats in Maryland undergoing, and then Maryland bat research, and then managing forests for bats. So let me see if I can. Okay. So let's start with the Earth diversity. So species on Earth, there's about 1.5 million described species. There's estimated to be 8.7 million to 2 billion species, so a lot of undescribed ones. And of those, mammals comprise about 6,500 species. And bats are about 25% of that total at 1,600. So there's a lot of bats in the world. So the most abundant group of mammals, of course, are rodents. I can't really see the top. Oh, there we go. What is it? So what is a bat? So classification. So they're in the kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, so they have backbones. They're mammals, class Mammalia, and order Chiroptera. And Chiroptera is Latin for hand wing. And we can see that a bat's, if you look at the bat's wing, so the bat there on the right, the long-toothed bat, you can see those light-colored little bones that go down through the wing and support the wing. And those are actually the phalanges. So those are the fingers that are comparable to our fingers. It actually has a little thumb up on top, and then the rest of the fingers support the wing. So very much unlike what a bird's wing is, but it has the same arm bones too. It's kind of neat. And of course, the unique thing about bats, differentiated from all other mammals, is that they fly. They're truly fly, not glide like, flying squirrels or some other critters. So there's two basic suborders of bats. There's the Megachiroptera. So mega means big, and these are the big bats. So the fruit bats, flying foxes, these are usually big guys. They comprise only about 15% of all the bat species. They don't echolocate. They use their eyes to find food, and they're mostly in Africa, Asia, and Australia. They primarily feed on fruits, but also on pollen and some other things. So the other suborder is Microchiroptera, and those will be all the bats that we have here in North America. And they comprise the majority of bats worldwide, 85%. And they echolocate, and they're found everywhere except Antarctica. So they're very widespread, and they have a very diverse diet. And where do bats come from? So the oldest bat fossil we know of was found in Wyoming in the early Eocene, 50 million years ago. And strangely enough, that bat had already developed echolocation skills and was very much like our Microchiroptera that we have today. So I wouldn't be surprised if we find another fossil that's much older than that. Bats come in all kinds of sizes. The smallest bats, the bumblebee bat, weighs less than a penny and a 3.5-inch wingspan, known from Thailand. It's actually a pretty rare bat there. The largest bat is the giant golden crowned flying fox, has over a 5-foot wingspan, weighs 3 pounds, and it occurs in the Philippines. Some people actually harvest and eat these bats, so they're actually becoming very rare. So there's a great diversity of bats, as you might imagine. And here's just a quick little suite of different bats from around the world. You know, and strange enough, I think one of the coolest ones here is the spotted bat from Utah. I mean, look at those crazy ears, and the pelage is pretty spectacular as well. So are bats blind? We all have heard that adage. No, they're not. They actually can see pretty well. So especially the fruit bats, they have really good eyesight. But even our bats do have eyes, and they do use them. But they don't use them too much, our bats, to navigate at night. What they do use is echolocation, and kind of think of it as sonar. So they send out sound signals and through their mouth, and then they receive back signals to their ear. They have a very specialized little projection there inside their ear called the tragus. It's very unique to each species, but that helps direct the sounds back and lets them figure out where things are, how fast they're moving, and all that. They have very, very advanced echolocation. Matter of fact, the US Navy studied the echolocation to further develop their sonar abilities. So these little sounds that they make are very high frequency. They're above frequencies that you and I can hear. So, you know, basically 30 kilohertz and above, we can hear up to about 20 kilohertz. And each, the sounds that each species makes is unique, and it can be displayed on this as a sonogram. So it's basically just a visual view of what the sound looks like. You can see the red bat there on the right is like a flat level little squiggle there at around 40 hertz. And little brown bat is like a little, has a little tilt to it, goes up, it's a little higher. And then the northern long-eared bat is nearly straight up and down and much, much higher in frequency. And we can actually use recorders to record bat calls and determine the species. That's one of the techniques that we're going to talk about later for monitoring bats. You know, on the other side of things, insects have the ability to hear high frequencies as well, in different ways. The katydids, they're on the leg, and it's on the body of a moth. And they can actually detect the sounds of a bat, their echolocation call. And they can respond with invasive maneuvers to try and outsmart the bat. So it's kind of an ongoing evolutionary battle of the bat echolocating to find its prey, and the prey trying to determine where the bat is to avoid it. And the tiger moths are pretty far advanced in this little battle, where they actually can send out their own signals. And these moth clicks actually jam the sonar of the bat. It makes it really hard for the bat to locate the moth. And it's also kind of a warning for a bat that has ever caught a tiger moth, because they're poisonous. So kind of saves them both. So there's different kinds of bat roosts. Bat roosts in caves, rock crevices, dead trees, actually also live trees, human dwellings, and in the foliage. And it depends on the species of the bat and the time of year as to where you might find it. Oh, that one didn't come out. Oh, there you go. So bats eat a variety of different things. All of our bats here are insectivorous bats. They eat, you know, moths, beetles, all kinds of flying insects, mosquitoes. But in other parts of the United States and the world, there's fruit-eating bats. They're frugivorous. And there are bats that eat pollen, bats that specialize in eating frogs, bats that specialize in eating fish. They can echolocate the surface of waters and look for current, like the top, the dorsal fin of a fish. They can detect that and dive down and catch the fish. Then there's even a few bats that eat other vertebrates, including other bats. So, and of course, there's one really unique set of bats, 3 species that are vampire bats. And these are really an interesting group of bats. I had one of my professors when I was an undergraduate physiologist did his dissertation on vampire bats and their highly efficient kidneys. So a vampire bat can drink its more than its weight in blood in a single sitting. And he was basically investigating how they can do that and then still fly. And they can do that because while the bat's drinking the blood, they have the kidneys that are so efficient that they can process that fluid through their bodies before they have to take off. So they basically urinate out all the fluid before they take off. One of the neat things about vampire bats too is that we've derived a drug from them that some people who have had heart attacks or strokes can take. It's a blood thinner called Draculin, and it's derived from the saliva of the vampire bat. It's an anticoagulant that prevents clots from forming. Pretty cool. Bats are also pollinators. There's all kinds of different species of plants that bats are responsible for. Of course, agave for tequila, for those who like to imbibe, bananas, avocados, dates, and they're some of the major pollinators for some of these plants, mangoes and cashews. So we have a lot to thank bats for. Bats actually serve as an insect control too. Forest and crop pests. There's an estimated study that came out in the journal Science a couple years, well, maybe 4 or 5 years ago now, estimated that on the low side, bats eat about $3.7 billion worth of insects every year that the U.S. agricultural industry doesn't have to spend on insecticides. For an example, Bracken Cave in Texas, where there are Mexican free-tailed bats, that colony eats up to 200 tons of insects each night, which is about the weight of a blue whale. That's a lot of biomass being taken in every night by just one hibernacula. So reproduction in bats or hibernating bats here typically mate in the fall. They do a thing called fall swarming. They tend to mate at that time. There's some mating that goes on though during the hibernating season. But there's either sperm storage or delayed development. And then gestation is 50 to 60 days in the spring, the young are born in summer, and they start flying within around a month, give or take a week. And most of our species have 1 young per year. Some of the migratory bats we'll talk about do have 2. But all of our bats are pretty long-lived, 20 years or more, which is really fascinating for an animal so small. There's a correlation between the size of a mammal and its lifespan. And bats kind of throw that one out the window. Part of it may be because they're asleep half the year. So Maryland bats, we have 10 species. 4 of those species are what we call tree bats, and 6 are called cave bats or hibernating bats. All of our bats eat insects. The tree bats fly south in the wintertime. They either fly south or to the coast, to someplace warmer. And they're generally solitary or in small groups. They're usually really pretty bats. And they tend to migrate longer distances. And our cave bats hibernate in caves. They might migrate, but it's very short migration, maybe up to 100 miles, but even that's pretty far for most of them. It's much less, just a few miles generally. They hibernate in caves or also in, of course, buildings and other places. They tend to form colonies, large groups, and they're usually pretty much brown in color. Let's run down through the species that we have. We have the hoary bat, which is a really cool bat. It's the most recognizable bat in North America because it's a fairly unique pelage. It has that white frosted chocolate pelage and a little bit of a yellowish band around its face, and a big white patch on the shoulder. It's the largest bat we have in Maryland. It weighs a whole ounce. So that's about 3 pennies. So still very, very small biomass. They have about 5.5-inch body, 15-inch wingspan. They're highly migratory. This species is a really strong flyer. It's the only bat that made it to Hawaii and the Galapagos Islands. And they made it there and actually speciated. So we have like the Hawaiian hoary bat. But no other bat was able to make that long of a flight. So they're pretty spectacular. And they like pine or mixed hardwood forests, and they're pretty much just solitary. Eastern red bat's one of the most common bats we have. It's another migratory bat. It's red with white frosting on it, nice little white shoulder patch. It has kind of a V-shaped silhouette when it flies. This is a species you see around street lights and around edges. And again, it migrates to the coastal areas or south. And you can see this one sometimes fly like in January and February, where they'll actually overwinter in deep leaf litter in warmer areas, usually on south-facing hillsides. And when you get like little warm snaps in the winter, these little warm spells, red bats will come out and fly around. So if you see a bat flying around in the winter, there's a good chance it's a red bat. Silver-haired is another migratory species. It's kind of dark and silvery white frosted pelage. It's migratory as well, and it really likes old forests, coniferous, mixed or deciduous forest. It roosts in tree cavities. You know, red bats we just saw, it typically roosts, the last bat, in tree foliage, like in leaf clusters. This one, though, actually does use tree cavities, especially for maternity roosts. And it'll feed in small clearings like light gaps and along forest roads and waterways. And the evening bat, this one, you know, we don't see this too much in Maryland. We know they're around, but very uncommon to encounter. It's more of a southeast species. Very secretive. It likes large trees and snags. It's found in riparian areas. The only one I ever saw was along the Potomac River. So it's a species that really likes to eat. It's real big into beetles for its food, but it definitely goes south for the winter. Tricolor bats, now we're into our cave hibernating bats. This was a really common species in Maryland. It was any cave in Maryland, even the small caves, you would find 1 or 2 of these guys, and you'd find them in good numbers, you know, 100, 200 in our bigger caves. Its fur is like reminds me of like a red fox. It's really kind of pretty, kind of an orangish yellow. And one of the characteristics for identifying this species is the red forearm. So you can see that forearm in that upper left picture hanging out. It kind of has a reddish pinkish color to it. It's kind of unique. Big brown is a very common bat in Maryland. They often roost in houses in the summer and the winter. But we find them in caves and tunnels in the wintertime as well. They're a gleaning species. They usually don't catch as many species on the fly as some other bats, but they will actually grab like beetles or big moths that are perched on leaves or on tree trunks. They can detect them there and they'll just glean them right off the surface. Little brown bat, another bat that was very common in Maryland, common inhabitant in our cave hibernacula. They really like bat boxes. If you had a bat box, this was probably the species that you had in there. I had over 100 of them in the bat box at my house. But a pretty indistinct little brown bat. And the next bats we're going to be talking about are all kind of like that. They're difficult to identify. Very key characteristic things that actually some of them take some practice to be able to distinguish. And an Indiana bat is certainly one of those, very, very similar looking to little brown bats. They too hibernate in caves. This is a exceedingly rare bat. It's fairly endangered. We haven't seen one in Maryland here since, I guess, the early 2000s. We have very few records in our caves, very few records for summer maternity roosts. But this is called the cluster bat, is a nickname for it. This bat can reach densities in hibernating clusters of 250 bats per square foot. So really tight packed in there. When they do censuses, surveys for these in the wintertime in caves that have a lot, and there aren't many, they actually take pictures of the clusters and then come back to the lab and count noses, because they're really tough to count, as you can see in that photograph. Really cool little bat. They're also very susceptible to disturbance during hibernation. They wake up really easily, burn through their fat reserves, and can die. So it's one of the reasons that they're endangered. That and that most of the 300,000 bats of the species that exist, 75% of them are in 10 caves. So they're really susceptible to extirpation. So northern long-eared bat, this is a bat that we used to have in the landscape, one of the most common species we would encounter in the summertime when we were mist netting. They have a really long ear, really long tragus. You can see that little projection at the bottom of the ear. It's the tragus. It's characteristic for a lot of different species, and this one, it's really long. It's a solitary bat, hibernates in our caves. You don't see them much in the caves, but there's a lot of them around. We're not sure really where they go in the winter. Are they in rock piles or just deep in the crevices in the caves where we don't see them? Never quite figured that out. The eastern small-footed bat, this is our smallest bat in Maryland. It's a teeny tiny little bat. And he's the bandit bat. He has that black mask that is really unique to this species. They roost in caves. They're really rare. They're actually listed as endangered in Maryland. We have very few records. They like to live in talus slopes, and now and then you'll see one in a cave entrance hibernating. Pretty neat little bat though. So threats to bats. Disease is probably #1 these days. Habitat loss, decline in prey from insecticide use, wind turbines, we'll talk more about that, and disturbance to maternal or hibernating colonies. Those are the big threats. And I review wind turbine projects here in Western Maryland, and we had the unfortunate situation here where we have higher wind turbine mortalities on bats than anywhere else in the world. We average about 90 to 100 bats killed per turbine per year at our wind power facilities. We've been working with wind power companies to try to mitigate the impact by doing what's called curtailment, which we just have the wind turbines not spin until it gets windy. Bats don't like to fly in the wind. The mortality that's observed, as you can see in this photograph, that's a hoary bat, are mostly migratory bats. And most of this mortality occurs during migration in the spring and particularly the fall. And you might not realize it, but these wind turbine blades they're big. You see them in a distance. They look like they're lazily moving around, but these are big wind turbine blades. And what you get is at the tips of those blades, because they're so big, even though it looks like it's moving slow, they're actually moving about 190 miles an hour. And the bats just, they can't deal with that. The bat doesn't even have to be hit by that turbine blade. It can be close to the blade, and it causes a barometric pressure shift that can actually explode the lungs on the bat and still kill them without even having contact. So wind turbines and migratory bats, bad news. But by doing this curtailment, we've actually cut down the mortality rate by 50%. But still, when you think about the thousands and thousands of wind turbines these guys have to fly through, going north, south to north and north to south during their migration, it's like going through a field of blenders. It's pretty tough for them. But the big news for bat mortality in recent times is white nose syndrome. And this is an introduced fungus that has killed the vast majority of our cave hibernating bats, virtually all species. We estimate 6 million bats lost since white nose syndrome first arrived, which was in 2006. It was first discovered in New York at a commercial cave, and it was thought to be brought in by someone that came from Europe, likely, and just had fungal spores on their shoes or clothes and went into a commercial cave. And then it was here. Our bats didn't evolve with it. So they basically had no protection. This fungus invades their body during the winter when they're hibernating. Their immune system shut down at that time. And it causes the bats to wake up, to come out of torpor, come out of hibernation twice as frequently as they normally would. They burn up their fat and they basically just starve to death. And we've seen anywhere from 90 to 100% mortality in our hibernacula in Maryland and range wide. And the fungus Pseudogymnoascus destructans, PD for short, kind of infects the bare skin portions of the bat, so its wings and its muzzle. And you can see from these photographs that the hyphae actually will go down into where there are little root hairs going, or roots of the hairs going down in. And the conidia and the hyphae will actually bypass the epidermis by doing that and enter the dermis, where they cause a lot of problems. It's not just the disruption of torpor, it's also all these physiological effects that occur, such as causes weight loss, dehydration, electrolyte imbalances, and eventually death. And this is where it spread. It started there in 2006 in New York. You can see the little red circle. And then you can see in the little color graph there how it spread year by year, got to Maryland in 2010. And it's made big jumps out to the west to Washington State. And that was probably by people, cavers, transporting it, caving in the east, going back home, caving in the west, spreading the fungus. Highly unlikely that bats spread it that far, but most of the spread from site to site, though, has been due to bats carrying it. So these are the species affected in Maryland. All six of our hibernating species are affected, but they're not affected equally. Big brown bats are not very affected. We saw a little bit of a mortality initially, but big brown bats have rebounded and seem to be doing okay. That's not the case for our other 5 species. Eastern small-footed bats did see mortality for sure. Numbers are down, but they're not terrible. But little brown, tricolored, and northern long-eared bats were severely hit. We had 95 to 99% mortality in our hibernacula. And those 3 species are under review for federal listing. Now, these were the 3 most common bats that we had in Maryland, and now they're under federal review for listing. So that just tells you how serious this whole situation is. That's their current status. Northern long-eared bats actually are federally threatened right now. They've been boosted up to that, but that's being reevaluated. They may be being moved to endangered. We've done a lot of research here in Maryland in relation to white nose syndrome impacts. We've done a lot of monitoring of our populations. We were lucky that Dr. Gates at the Appalachian Lab had a couple of students back in the late 70s, early 80s that got some really early data. And then I picked up bat survey work in around 1990. So we had a really good data set of what bat populations were for all these species in Maryland before white nose syndrome got here. So our data has been very valuable. So we've done a lot of pre-post studies, and we're using these different techniques: hibernacular trapping, winter hibernacular census, actually going into the caves, mobile acoustic monitoring. We put a bat call recorder on top of a car and drive breeding bird routes, summer mist netting, and stationary acoustic surveys. And this is some of our results from the winter hibernacular surveys. So you can see the red line is where white nose syndrome invaded Maryland. And you can see how numbers, the bar graphs are each individual species, and those are kind of nicknames for them. Pisu would be tricolored bats, and little browns, Milu. That's the first two letters of the genus and species. But you can see how the numbers declined after white nose syndrome hit. Numbers just plummeted. Now the green bar are big brown bats. They were not really that affected. As a matter of fact, their numbers have come back to be higher what they were in some sites. And that could have been possibly they were, their numbers were affected by the other bats, and there's been competitive release of that species. But all the other cave hibernating bats have not done well. And you can see the line graph then is a total of all the numbers of bats in these long-term hibernacula that we've been monitoring all these years. Not good. And they don't really seem to be recovering except for the big brown bat. Some additional data to show what's happened at our hibernacula. You know, when we do hibernacular surveys, we don't necessarily see all the bats because they can be back in crevices or in passages that are too small for our bodies to fit. So we actually do harp trapping. We catch them coming out in these traps out of the caves in the spring. And you can look at the pre-white nose syndrome graph, pre-WNS, and then post-WNS. And let's move down to the totals. And captures, we had 1,236 captures. This was equal effort before and after. And then after white nose syndrome, we had 26 captures. And our capture rate, number of bats per hour, is 2% of basically what it used to be. Really, really huge impacts on our cave hibernating bats. One of the ones worst hit was the long-eared bat. We did a radio tracking telemetry study on these to find where they were summer roosting, so we could protect the summer roost. It's part of the federal laws. You can protect summer roost site for these and areas around it. So we had a crew that did some telemetry, and this was on Dan's mountain where we had the highest densities of northern long-eared bats before white nose syndrome at this site. We had, we were catching, 50 bats a night in our mist nets. And even after white nose syndrome, there still are bats there, but we're catching like one every 7 nights. But at least they're still there. We're not finding northern long-eared bats hardly anywhere else in Maryland. Very, very few locations. But we were able to put radio transmitters on these guys and follow them back to roost, which was pretty cool. And red maple, chestnut oak, different species. This was actually in an old growth forest on Dan's Mountain. It's probably why the densities were so high before and after white nose syndrome. We also did the moving acoustic surveys, which I mentioned earlier, using breeding bird routes. We had 18 routes across the state. We basically found the same thing. All of the cave hibernating bats that are highlighted here, all their numbers plummeted in occurrence. We started this study in 2010. It was near baseline. That's the year white nose hit. We didn't have a whole lot of sites affected that first year. We only had one site that had high mortality. So it's a pretty good study to show how white-nose syndrome affected those species. And the migratory bats that aren't affected by white-nose syndrome, you know, the data was just, you know, variable. So they didn't seem to have any impact from white-nose syndrome. So some of this data that we've collected, especially the Hibernating data over time, has been really useful in both regional research and global research. So this particular paper here that we contributed to, we looked at bat populations in North America and Europe. And we always knew that European bat populations were really small compared to what we have in North America. Could never really figure that out before. But what we found with collaboration from our colleagues, bat biologists in Europe, was our densities now that we have white-nose syndrome, which they had, are now comparable. So it may be a fact that now that we had this disease, we will always just have depressed bat populations like Europe does. And this is another study that was done looking basically range-wide how white-nose syndrome has affected bat populations. And again, Maryland had a really good data set to contribute to this analysis. And basically all these other states throughout the range of white-nose syndrome, which is basically the eastern and Midwestern part of the United States and then 7 provinces in Canada, we have all seen the same thing, 90 to 99% mortality of our cave hibernating bats, with the exception of big birds. So, you know, these are different things we're looking at for conservation recovery after white-nose syndrome, basically hoping that there's going to be some natural selection. There's no definitive evidence at this point that there's resistance natural selection going on, but there's some hints that it could be going on. So a lot of researchers are looking into that. But in the meantime, we're trying to limit disturbance during hibernation. We don't want to wake them up any more than the fungus is, protect summer roosting and foraging habitats so they can reproduce, limit and slow the spread. There's different kinds of treatments that have been tried. Honestly, in my opinion, it's just never going to work because you can't use a lot of these things in cave environments because there's other cave fauna in there that depends on fungi and bacteria. So you have to really be careful of where you use things like that in their hibernation areas. So, and we like to do things that enhance reproduction and survival. So we are now at managing forest for bats. And you know, there's a lot of information, a publication that came out was done by the white-nose syndrome group and a subgroup that I was not part of, put together a publication looking at managing forests for these bat species that are being affected by white-nose syndrome. And I'll have a link up here later for that. But you can get a lot of data out of that. Unfortunately, one thing about that publication that I didn't particularly care for is it was a little too weighted towards the southeast, which I think was kind of unfortunate because most of the mortality for white-nose syndrome has been more in the northern part of the country. So anyway, for tree roosts, it's one of the most important things that we can do for cave hibernating bats and some migratory bats as well, as far as managing for their habitat. And this should be really a primary concern anytime a tree harvest is done or a management plan is written, that it provides sufficient dead standing, dying, hollow, or called trees for these guys to roost in. It's a very important part of what what bats need. These cave hibernating bats, their maternity roost in large part are in hollow trees or in, you know, a couple of species maybe in rock outcrops. But it's not just leaving them behind during a cut. It's actually having a plan for the development and sustained yield of large diameter hollow trees within stands. So if you just leave a couple of dead snags in a harvest, those things are going to fall over in 5 to 10 years, and then you're not going to have anything. You really have to plan for the future. And there should be an abundant selection of potential tree roosts to allow for roost switching behavior. So when we did that telemetry study of northern long-eared bats, we found that they switch trees every 1 to 2 days. They need lots of roosts in close proximity for them to have places to move back and forth to avoid predation and to keep parasite loads low. So really, really important. Rock roosts are pretty unique. Small-footed bats, this is where you find those guys. In the summertime, they may even winter hibernate in these areas. Really, really important habitat for them. And that's a bat that forages within the canopy, within the canopy of surrounding forests in these areas. So you really would be good at, it's a great idea just to provide forest for that species around these rock outcrops. And it's not just bats that need these. Allegheny wood rats, there's a lot of species that use these talus and rock outcrop areas that require forest around them. It's a good idea to manage them in that way. And then retain forest corridors between these habitats. Again, it allows all these animals to move back and forth, but stay in the forest cover where it's safe, where they can forage, and where they feel comfortable. Water is critically important for bats. 25% of the water used by a bat each day comes from drinking. Of course, the rest will come from the insects that they eat, but they still need to drink. And then a lot of bats, like little brown bats that forage over rivers and streams, they're feeding on a lot of aquatic insects. So there's that component of having the water source nearby. It provides their food. And this can be a lot of different sources. Some of the best places for us to catch bats are over vernal pools, ponds, along spring runs, streams, and rivers. That's where we set up our mist nets to catch a lot of species of bats. There are some, though, that aren't as in tune to that. They still come there to drink water, but some bats don't really forage there so much. And managing for upland and lowland water sources, if there's a vernal pool or a pond up on top of the mountain, it's important to keep it, there, and to keep the water quality in it good. That's the other thing. This has to be water that is drinkable, not a stagnant, puddle in the road. So managing forest for bats, we're looking at caves. Caves within forest lands are critical bat habitat. Again, retain forest cover in the vicinity of caves. It's good not just for the bats, but for all cave life. There's all kinds of invertebrates and vertebrates that go in and out caves, rely on caves, and they also require forest. So cave entrances and fields are not good. And then prevent the alteration of groundwater, surface water in the cave. One of the critical factors of where bats hibernate in a cave is by temperature and humidity. Humidity is very critical. Bats need really high humidity, some higher than others, but they all need it in like the 80 to 90% range. They need that moisture going into the cave. Again, caves and fields, not good. Keep forest cover around them, and don't disrupt subsurface water flow on hillsides or streams and stuff in the area. There might be sinking streams that go into the cave. These are usually limestone areas. And then, basically restrict human access during the hibernating season at those caves that receive human activity to them. No reason to put a gate on a cave that doesn't have people going in it. But every time I gated a cave in Maryland, numbers of bats immediately went up and continued to climb. It was the one thing I could do to ensure that bat populations were increasing in a site was to gate the cave. So managing for forest, foraging habitat. You know, there's a lot of this. Down below is the link to the Forest Management Bats publication. There's a lot of information there. I try just to touch on a couple of little things. But the one key component here is for those bats that we're really concerned about right now, most of the almost all the bats that are affected by white nose syndrome, and even a couple of the migratory bats, they reach their highest densities and do best in structurally complex mature forests with small gap. Ideally, old growth forest. That's really, it's what they evolved with. That's what they do best in. Now they can live in other forests, and there's ways that you can harvest forests and still have good habitat. But that is the pinnacle, is old growth forest. Uneven age management is preferable to even age management for most bat species, except for those that are really common, like the big brown bat. They're not really picky. They'll forage over crop fields and all kinds of places. And some of the migratory bats, like red bats, are likewise. They're not really that picky. But for those bats that we're really most concerned about, uneven aged forest, you know, things like group selection, where you have small gaps in the canopy, less than 5 acres, and retaining those forest buffers along waterways, those are great things to do. We have a couple of federally listed bats in Maryland. Indiana bats, like I said, we've had so few records in recent times. We don't really do have much in the way of restrictions for that species, because the few hibernacula we had them in, we haven't seen them there in almost 15, 20 years or more. But northern long-eared bats, we still have a few on the landscape. Right now, they're being managed as a threatened species under the 4D rule. Requires no harvest within 100 feet of documented roost trees from June 1st to June 31st. We have very few documented roost trees, so that's not much of a hindrance to forest management right now. And no harvest within a quarter mile of a known hibernacula. But we've had, I think, 2 northern long-eared bats in hibernacula since 2010. So we don't really have many of them left in our hibernacula either. And then wrapping things up, if you want to attract bats, bat boxes are great. This is a rocket box. I've been putting bat boxes up in state forests, state parks. They still do get a few bats in them. They're not like they used to be, but bat boxes actually work really well if you have the right design. And you know, in the areas short on old hollow tree, you know, big hollow trees, it is a temporary solution. You know, provide a water source, but in the end, you know, leaving snags and planning for snags in the future, those are the things to do. And you can attract bats through moth gardens. And really what you're doing is you're trying to boost invertebrate population, diversity, densities. And you can do that best with native species if you do plantings. And invasive species, and you know, we have that, it's such a problem in parts of Maryland that does really reduce the number of insects and invertebrates that bats eat. So down with invasives. I think that's the end of my talk.
Dan, that was great. Oh, my video. There we go. That was great, Dan. I appreciate that. Wow. I have lots of questions, and we have some questions in the chat. So thank you. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. So one of the questions that came up in the chat is, what is the most common mammal? You mentioned the most common mammal. It's the rodent. Is that?
Yeah, it's rodents, and they make up about a little over half of all species in the world. So mice and voles, and, rats, you know, all kinds of rodents. It's a really diverse group. Great. As we well know.
Yeah. So one of my questions is, so they use their eyes and they use echolocation. So do I need to worry about one of them flying into me?
Yeah, so there's always that old adage of bats getting caught in the hair.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting. There was this old publication in Pennsylvania from the late 1800s. It was quoted in Shoemaker. I can't remember who the original was, but he talked about a bat being caught in a woman's hair at this festival. And he said that was a sure sign that this woman was not true and she was not a virgin any longer, and that she should be outcast. That's about how true flying in a bat in your hair bats is. So that correlation is about as meaningful.
Okay.
Now, I did see once in all my travels, and I've been in hundreds and hundreds of caves in many, many, many states, that I did see a bat get tangled in a woman's hair, and it was in a tight passage that she didn't see the bat, and the bat wasn't even flying, and she bumped into it, and it did get tangled because I had to get it out of her hair.
Yeah.
But she had really long frizzy hair, but that's the only time I've ever heard or seen that occurring. Bats are pretty good at avoiding you.
Okay.
They really are. When we capture them in harp traps, a harp trap looks like a harp. It's a metal square frame. It has monofilament fishing line strung from top to bottom. And their echolocation is so good that they see that monofilament fishing line, the first strung, but behind that, they don't know. We have a second layer that they don't quite catch. So they'll go through the first layer sideways and then hit the second one, and then they fall into a little basket, and then that's how we catch them. And it doesn't hurt them at all. It's a really great way to catch them. But trying to catch them in bird mist nets, oh, you have to be a genius. I mean, they'll come and fly down, and they'll see a thing, and they'll fly straight up right in front of it. So they're not going to fly into you.
Okay. I like, they're almost like daredevils then, how it feels like they get so close,
Oh, they do, but it's all choreographed. They know exactly what they're doing.
Okay, that I was trying to trust that the other night, and I was like, just still stand here. You don't need to move, Agnes. They're not going to bump you. So now I heard it from Dan that I can still stand there. They're not going to get into me. Okay, great.
Yeah. I had a picnic at my house, and I had 100 bats in my bat box, and the picnic table was nearby. And all the kids at the picnic would sit on the picnic table with us and watch the bats come out, and they would come out and fly towards them. They just loved that. But all of those 100 bats never came near a kid ever.
Wow.
They never hit one. They come near, but they never hit.
Freaky. That's freaky. Not this is, I think what's interesting is the katydids have ears on their legs, and the moth, you opened up a whole even new topic for Woodland Wildlife Wednesday. Where are animals' ears?
Yeah, that's crazy, isn't it? And they're very sensitive too.
Wow.
Yeah.
So interesting. So interesting. We had a question in the chat. Why would a bat migrate if it's such a short distance?
Well, so we had an Indiana bat that was radio tagged near Penn State in central Pennsylvania at a cave there. It was coming out, and they followed it by plane down to Carroll County, Maryland. And it roosted in a big old giant shagbark hickory that was along a stream. It had a nice forest patch, but it was by some agricultural land. Indiana bats don't mind having some edge in their habitat. But, I wish I could ask that bat why he did that, because it was 113 miles. And why couldn't he find that in Pennsylvania? I have no idea.
Huh.
But we've had bats that had been banded in New York and have flown to West Virginia. They were banded in a hibernacula in New York State and flew to West Virginia to hibernate the next year.
Oh, wow.
And it was another Indiana bat. So they can get around, but most of our bats stay pretty local. You always have animals that are dispersers. So it could be part of that. you know. That's how genes get moved around. And, you know, and in the long run, that's great for populations. So
Yeah. Do you think they leave a baby there then in West Virginia? Like they would have reproduced in West Virginia and maybe gone back to New York later?
well, that bat actually hibernated, so it's overwintered in West Virginia. But
Okay.
what did it do the next year? You know, the transmitters only last for a couple of weeks.
Okay.
So you have to follow them by plane. So, you know, the bats are so little that as good a technology as we have, the transmitters, that can't be more than 5% of a body weight of an animal. That's like a standard thing in the animal world. You don't want to be that to be a burden on that animal, because one, you're going to get bad data because you're weighing it down. It's not going to do normal things. But two, you don't want to, you know, be mean to it.
Yeah.
So we don't really know what that bat did the next year. But we do know that a lot of the bats have stayed pretty local. The ones that I've had banded, you know, you don't get a lot of band recoveries, but when you do, they're usually pretty close by. Every now and then, a bat biologist will send out to our listserv, hey, I recovered this band number, blah, blah, blah. Whose is it? But you don't get that real often.
Okay.
Now, migratory bats are different because, you know, they're not hibernating. They're moving. They're snowbirds of sorts.
I was thinking that too. I was like,
yeah.
the longest fingered snowbirds there are.
They are.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Can you explain the delayed development? You said that's one of their techniques. Can you explain the delayed development and when that comes into play and why they do that?
Yeah, so I mean, so they have either delayed fertilization or delayed implantation. So they mate in the fall. A thing occurs at cave and hibernacle entrances called fall swarming. And it's when all the bats kind of congregate at potential areas to hibernate, and they check it out. Am I going to go this one, or am I going to go to the one I know over here? And at that same time, because you have all of these bats doing that, it's like a mingling time. You might think of it as the local bar. You know, they're all there, they're hanging out, and it's a great time to mate. You know, that's where you see, you know, oh, look at all these females running around. I'm going to go chase them. So, but they don't want to have young right away because they're going into hibernation. So what they do is that the female either stores the sperm in her uterus, and then when she wakes up in the spring, then, you know, the sperm will move over and fertilize the egg. And there's other animals that do it. Mustelids do this. So weasels and skunks do the same thing. They kind of get together in the fall, but they don't actually have young until the spring. And it's species that, you know, typically hibernate or are pretty inactive or have restricted food sources in the wintertime, that it's not a good time for an embryo to be growing.
Okay.
Yeah. But then sometimes, you know, some species, the sperm will actually fertilize the egg, and the egg just stops. It doesn't divide anymore, and it just stays like that. And then in the spring, you know, it'll implant and then it'll divide. So lots of weird things in the animal world.
So yeah, you're reading my mind, Dan. I'm like, this is so fascinating. I did not, like, you are introducing so many cool things along with the bats. Like, this is just so, I have so many questions here, and I'm not even asking all of them right now. So you touched on this. I wrote this question down, but then I think you touched on this when you talked about tree harvest. When do bats migrate? When can you please remind us again the best times to harvest?
You know, if it was just a bat world and there were no economics or logistics involved in harvesting, the perfect world would be not to harvest basically from, you know, June 1st, well, at least June 1st to July 31st. That catches a lot of them. Maybe Indiana bats are a little earlier, so May you might want to exclude. But, you know, I always thought that's the same time that birds reproduce, you know? So there's another good reason not to harvest during that period of time. You're not cutting down trees that have bird nests in them, or ground nesting birds. You're not disrupting them with equipment or road building or whatever. So yeah, in an ideal world, that's how things maybe would be.
So what are some tips if I am harvesting at that time? What are some tips for, bat friendly harvest? Can you remind us of that?
Yeah, so I mean, like I said, the number one things that you can do is, retain summer roost sites for a lot of these bats that require cavity roost. And, and that's true. And again, it's not just bats that benefit from that. It's birds as well. It's, chickadees and all these other species that are, woodpeckers that are cavity nesters. If you think about, I always try to think of what conditions these animals evolved under pre-colonial conditions. And the majority of our forest was old growth, mature forest.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, where I live, like beside Big Run State Park, the largest sawmill in the county was situated right there in the middle of the park. And it ran for 35 years. They logged that. I mean, they weren't logging early successional forest. I can tell you that.
Right.
That was not what was there.
Yeah.
So, you want to try and mimic that landscape that was optimal for those species that evolved in it. So you want to think, an assortment of tree ages, there were natural disasters, wind throw and things like that did create even age stands. It's not that they weren't there, they were, but that wasn't the majority of the landscape. But, try to manage to retain some of these big trees. They might not be hollow at the time, but, give them a chance. Let a tree grow to senescence. Wow. I mean, I know that's a novel idea, but that's how things used to be. Yeah. I mean, Native Americans weren't chopping down trees with flint axes. I can tell you that. I mean, that would have been a big chore. They did it to make maybe a little cabin or something, or poles for a teepee. But these are all new things that all these animals that evolved under different conditions have to deal with. So anything you can do, keep a portion of your land, a small chunk of it in that, especially like along riparian areas, might as well pick the best habitat to let it grow. So, retention of these snags, and like I said, plan for future snags. I see so many harvests that occurred on state forest land that, we retained 3 snags, per acre. And I go back there 10 years, there's no snags.
Right, because they're all gone.
Dead trees, and they were exposed. You took all the trees from around them and they became wind throws. Mm-hmm. But it's the live trees with cavities. If you're harvesting and you're selecting trees to be cut, if you're down to that level and you see, a larger size tree that has cavities already in it, but it's alive, wow, that's the one you want to keep because it's going to be there for decades, not the dead one really. So there are things you can do like that. I said, protect water sources, try to go for some uneven management, even if it's just part of your property or whatever, make those small light gaps. There's a lot of bats that key in on foraging and light gaps. They don't like 50-acre clear cuts that much. Okay, big browns do, and red bats do. There's a couple of those really common species that they don't really care where it is. It could be your street. Right. But the bats we're most worried about, northern long-eared bats, Indiana bats, small-footed bats, they're species that forage in the forest canopy. Mm-hmm. And they like that structural diversity. It's, you have canopy, subcanopy, mid-layer, shrub layer. When you have all that diversity in the forest, and older forests too have higher diversity of forbs. Mm. Like spring ephemerals, they reach their peak in diversity in mature forests. And some of them actually don't really recover well from forest harvest. There's been some studies that show that. Plant diversity equals insect diversity. Because insects are tied to plants. Some are generalists, but there are a lot that are specialists. So you want to have as much diversity shrubs, trees, insects, feed on trees. You want to have all that stuff around. You want to have lots, because what happens is some insects, their flight periods or their period where they're above surface is just for part of a year.
Mm-hmm.
Might just be a few weeks even, or a mayfly, it might be a day. And, but the bats have to eat every day. So they need, something that's peaking at any certain point in time. They always need insects. So they have that diversity. There's almost always something that's abundant that they can feed on. You have, invasive plants in an area that's really been ravaged. It just doesn't give them a lot of choice.
Mm-hmm.
So those are some of the things that you can do.
You're bringing up some good management strategies that people can think about. Invasive species removal. And then, when you're talking, I'm thinking of even like patch cuts where you leave some patches, maybe you have 40 acres, you're leaving a patch that, you just don't even touch. That was the recommendation last night for a webinar I did for the Delmarva fox squirrel even. So
Yeah.
These strategies, like you said, are good for so many. And raising that diversity by offering soft edges in places. If you have a smaller property, you can create a soft edge rather than a hard edge. And
it's a great idea. Yeah.
You're giving us food for thought. I was picturing a shagbark hickory and thinking, how cute would that be that I flip up one of those, one of those.
Well, that's where they go. They get right up under the bark. It's perfect for them. And that's a live tree. That tree is going to live for hundreds of years if you let it.
Yeah.
And it's perfect habitat for them.
Yeah. Ready right there, nothing to do. Yeah. So I like how your presentation not only gave us really great information, which I put that rednosesyndrome.org in the chat if you want to check it out. I also put in the Maryland DNR Bats website there, so you can check that out. But I liked how you gave us information about bats, but then you're giving us ways that we're already thinking of managing our forests. So how can we do this that's going to be beneficial for all of them? And just, a PSA there, if you want to talk strategies, feel free to contact me. I'd be happy to brainstorm with you, figure out some ideas, help you get things down on paper. Dan, I'm sure people are welcome to contact you and maybe your colleagues there, eh?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we appreciate you being there for us. I do have lots more questions, but I see that the time is 1:15. I don't want to leave anybody from lunch, but Dan knows me and knows that I tend to have a lot of questions when I talk to him. So hopefully we'll have him again at Woodland Wildlife Wednesdays. Dan, we appreciate it. We appreciate the work that you're doing for Maryland's wildlife, letting us become aware of our own landscape and our own communities and how we can help our own communities. We really appreciate the work and commitment you have to your state. So thank you for that.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate it. I really enjoyed the time here.
Great. Thank you, guys. We appreciate it. See you next month in July for our Emerald Ash Borer update for Maryland. So we appreciate you guys being here too. Take care and stay in touch. Let me know if you need if you want to talk forests.